Thank you again for joining us this evening. My name is Dr. Kelly Burgoyne. I'm a lecturer in language disorders at the University of Manchester in the UK. Tonight's session, which is the first of our online advice sessions for people who are supporting students with Down syndrome during the coronavirus pandemic, is focused on supporting literacy development. The session is designed to be practical. There is no way within an hour I could give you a comprehensive overview of literacy development for children with Down syndrome, but what I am trying to do within this next hour is to give you some practical advice, some practical strategies that you can implement at home during this time to get you started. Okay, so this is really a focus on the practical. The other thing I want to say is that these sessions are primarily aimed at parents. We have a number of speech and language therapists who have registered for sessions, and we also have a number of educators who have registered. But these sessions are primarily designed to support parents who are teaching their children at home during this time. Okay. So tonight I'm going to talk about literacy development. I'm going to start by talking briefly about preschool reading and early reading development for children with Down syndrome. I'm then going to move on to talk about supporting literacy for all, with a focus on what should I be teaching, what are the things that I should be teaching to support literacy development for my child at this time. And I want to flag here that literacy is a very complex process. So we're going to be talking about quite a few different things this evening, but essentially we're going to talk through each component, and we're going to talk about some practical ideas, some practical strategies that help to support your child's literacy development in each of those components. So hopefully it should be quite clear as we move through. I'm then going to spend a bit of time just thinking about how literacy development can be brought into some of the everyday things that you're doing at home. Because I'm aware that structured and focused teaching is sometimes difficult, particularly at this time when we've all got so many other things going on. So I want to spend a bit of time thinking about how literacy can be developed in everyday kind of activities that we're just doing anyway. And at the end of the session, I'm going to point you to some further information and resources that you can access to try and find out some further ideas, and also some of the resources that I will have pointed out during the session as we go through. But I want to start with the take-home messages, or that might be more accurately the stay-home messages right now. And those take-home messages, I think, are threefold. The first is to just do what you can. We're all battling many different pressures at the moment, and it's really important that you and your family stay well. So just do as much as you can during this time, and don't put too much pressure on yourselves to be doing everything. Just do what you can. The second message is there's much you can do to support literacy development at home, and whether that's structured and focused teaching or as part of more general everyday activities. And hopefully the ideas that I give you will allow you to do both of those things. But there's a lot that you can do to support your child's literacy development at home at this time. And some of those things will be easier than others, but we'll talk through some ideas and strategies, so you'll have lots of things to go away and try at the end of this session. And the last message is possibly the most important one, which is the importance of keeping it fun. Don't let it become something that stresses you and stresses your child out. You don't need that right now, and it's important that literacy is kept fun for yours and your child's motivation. And I hope you'll see as we go through that many of the ideas and activities and suggestions are actually designed to be fun and can be made fun at home. So I want to start us off by thinking about early reading, and for this slide I'm really talking about our preschoolers. So here I'm thinking about our children who are between who are early years through to about 5. So it's kind of up until they go to school or within that first year of school as well. So oral language skills, our spoken language skills, are really important for reading. So at this time, what we want to be focused on is building those oral language skills to support children's reading development. Now, we know that children with Down syndrome find learning language difficult, okay? And we know that there are going to be delays there. But we also know that children find learning from looking easier than they find learning from listening. So we're going to be using visual supports to support language learning at this time. Now, print is, of course, a visual resource. So you may be aware that there is evidence to suggest teaching children to read from an early age using print-based activities can be useful for supporting language learning from an early age. And when I say an early age, really we would suggest these kinds of activities are started when children can understand between 50 and 100 words, and when they are able to match and select pictures. And that's kind of roughly when children are about 3 to 3.5 years old. I mean, that's going to vary because children are very variable in terms of how they develop. But about that time, then children will be ready to start some of these activities. There are some print-based learning programs available to support you in this. And here I've referenced the See and Learn Language and Reading Programme. So this programme is published by Down Syndrome Education International. It's available both as printed materials and as an app. And it's encouraging language learning through print-based activities through learning to read. Okay, so I would encourage you to have a look at See and Learn as a programme to support that. Now, at this time in these preschool years, another really important way of supporting language learning is to use shared or dialogic reading activities. So in shared or dialogic reading, all we're doing is it's adult and child sharing a book together and talking about the story. And there is a large evidence base to show that this is a really important way of supporting language in the early years for all children. So shared and dialogic reading is a really important activity you can do. Now, those two things I've talked about will be talked about again in the following sessions. So print-based activities to support language learning will be reviewed again in Becky's session tomorrow on supporting language development, and shared or dialogic reading will be covered again in Vesna's session on Thursday on early intervention and communication. So those things will come up again there. The other thing to mention about print-based activities for supporting early language in the early years is the importance of making personal books. So making personal books should be created together with the child. They're written from the perspective of the child. You can see an example here of a personal book developed to develop the carrier phrase, I can. So I can colour, I can read, I can walk. There are pictures here to support understanding of the written word. So making those personal books with children, creating them together at the child's language level is again a really important way to support language learning in these early years that is print-based and will support their learning difficulties while making use of their learning strengths. The other important thing to flag here is about the importance of promoting awareness of sounds in language. Now, this will be often tied into speech work that you're doing with your child, but is also really important for fostering phonological awareness, which we're going to talk about again a bit later on in the session. But thinking about teaching letter sounds to children and also working on some early phonological awareness games. And these two things we're going to come up and talk about again later. But essentially, for our preschool children, those are the things that I would be recommending that is supporting both oral language skills and early foundational reading skills. Now, once children start school, they should be learning to read with their peers in the classroom in exactly the same way that their peers are learning. Okay, so they're going to be following the same reading approaches as all the other children in the classroom are following at the same time. The difference is that for our children, they will need more intensive support and for longer than the other children that they are learning alongside. But the principles, the strategies, the teaching activities are the same. Okay, when we're thinking about supporting literacy and what should I teach, we should be looking at a comprehensive programme that targets literacy in all these ways. So we're going to be teaching letter sound knowledge, phoneme awareness and phonics. This is a phonics-based reading approach. We know now from research that this is an effective way of teaching children with Down syndrome to read, okay? So it's teaching letter sound knowledge, phoneme awareness and phonics, encouraging children to learn the alphabetic principle, to learn about the relationships between spoken and written words to help support their reading development. Now, alongside that, we're going to supplement that with some sight word learning. So we're going to be working on that too. And we're going to be doing all these things whilst practicing our reading with books, okay? Now, it's important to flag that reading comprehension is, of course, the goal of reading. So we want to make sure that we are supporting comprehension throughout all of these activities to make sure that children understand getting meaning from text is why we read, okay? So we're going to be supporting comprehension, reading for meaning throughout all of these activities. And lastly, you can see on here writing. Writing is an important part of literacy instruction for children, so we'll be thinking about how to support writing as well. Now you can see an image on here which is the reading and language intervention for children with Down syndrome, and I just want to flag that this is an evidence-based approach to reading and language instruction for children with Down syndrome. We did a large study which supported the use of this programme in schools, and this utilises a phonics-based approach to reading. This programme is available through Down Syndrome Education International. Again, there's a link at the end of the talk where you can find more information out about RLI and about how to access those resources. But importantly, what I want to flag here is that the things that we're talking about incorporating here and the things I'm going to go on to say in a second are based around and built into RLI, okay? So the first thing we're going to think about is how to support letter sound knowledge. So teaching children the sounds for printed letters. Okay, so we're teaching children to see an A and to say A, to see a T and to say T. Now, if you're not sure about the sounds in letters and what those should sound like, and some of them are a bit confusing, then I would encourage you to have a look on the internet. There are lots of resources out there that show you how to make those sounds correctly. So there's a link there to a YouTube video, which is a Jolly Phonics resource, and shows you somebody who is making all of the sounds that map on to the printed letters in the structure and sequence taught in Jolly Phonics. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that, and then you know you're making the sounds as they should be made when you're doing these kinds of activities. When we're teaching letter sounds, we want to give children lots of repeated opportunities to hear, say, see and write letters and the sounds that they make, okay? So multisensory teaching and lots of repeated opportunities to hear, say, see and write. You can use activities like matching and selecting printed letters to spoken sounds. So, for example, you might have some of the letter sounds out on cards in front of you and ask your child to find the S, or you might have a P and another P, and you're saying, you know, here is a P, can you find the other P in front of you? And you might start off with maybe just 2 or 3 letter cards or magnetic letters and gradually increase the number of distractors that children have in front of them to choose the one that they're looking for. Or you could simply match letters onto letters. We're looking for children being able to produce the sounds for those printed letters. Now, this is the child's best attempt at making those sounds. We know that many children have difficulties producing some of the speech sounds, but as long as you know that is their best attempt at making that speech sound, then that is what we are working towards. And that frequent practice, consolidation, revisiting those letter sounds will help to support increasing accuracy of making those letter sounds. Also, activities that involve tracing letters, copying letters, making letter shapes. So using pens, pencils, crayons, paint, sand, shaving foam, lots of different resources and tools to encourage children to make those letter shapes and make the sounds as they make those letter shapes. So they really are drawing their attention to the shapes of those letters and help to build that letter sound knowledge. The next thing that we're going to talk about is phonological awareness, and particularly phoneme awareness. So this is about children being aware of and able to manipulate the sounds in spoken language. So for example, knowing that bat starts with a B, as does bed, knowing that fox rhymes with box, for example, and knowing that cat is made up of the sounds k, a, and t. All of those are phonological awareness skills, okay? Being able to manipulate those sounds in spoken language is really important for reading development. So I want you to be playing games that encourage children's attention to the spoken sounds within words. So for example, playing I Spy games. Can you find something beginning with B? And you could do that with items around you in the house. You could do that with pictures in books that you're reading, or other visual scenes, but asking children to think of, be aware of, draw their attention to the sounds in words. You could also do activities that involve, for example, matching pictures that begin or end with the same sounds. Now, beginning sounds are easier than end sounds, so I would start with beginning pictures, and I would use simple CVC words like the ones you can see up here in the top right hand corner. Now, if you do a search online for CVC pictures, you'll find many printable and downloadable resources like these pictures that you see here that can be used in these kinds of reading activities or early foundational sound activities. So matching pictures that begin with the same sounds. For example, here's a pan, starts with a p, p, p. Can you find another picture that starts with a p, p, p? Now I want to say, and this applies to all of the activities I'm talking about today, I want you to be using errorless learning techniques. So this is making sure that your child can perform the activity and get the answer right. They don't stand a chance of getting it wrong, because you're going to support them, giving them as much support as needed, whether that's tapping on the right picture, whether that's pushing the right picture gently towards them, drawing their attention to it in some other way, to really encourage them to get that right. And as they start becoming more independent in these things, you can gradually withdraw some of the support that you give to them. You can play oral blending games. So for example, you might have a picture of a dog and a cat, and you might say to your child, can you find the d, o, g, d, o, g? Now blending is really difficult, so again we want to be supporting this as much as possible, and that might be tapping on that picture of the dog. It might be that you start off with just 2 pictures, and as the child gets a bit more comfortable, a bit more familiar, you introduce maybe a 3rd picture, maybe a 4th picture. You could play shopping games where you sound out items that you might have bought at the shop. So for example, I went shopping and I bought some and you might have some jam next to you. What did I buy? I bought some jam. So it's encouraging children to see the links between those spoken sounds and those spoken words and the pictures. You can also play some oral segmenting sounds. Now this is really tricky, so you might not get to segmenting early on, but that would be activities like, what sounds can you hear in cat? What's the first sound we can hear in cat? And so on and so forth. Now phonics is just applying those skills of phoneme awareness that we've just talked about, and that letter sound knowledge, which we talked about a second ago, to reading and writing. So lots of those activities that we've just been talking about you can do for phonics by including letters and letter shapes that we're going to work with. So it's basically doing those same activities but using letters to support the activities instead of just doing it with pictures and sounds. So you could use printed letters, so you could be making those letters yourselves. You could use magnetic or foam letters, so tactile letters that the child can move around, manipulate, pick up. You might decide to use letter cards, so printed letter cards, just like flashcards, but with just the letter on. And you could use phoneme frames. Now, phoneme frames are just like blocks with spaces in that you could push the letters into as you make the picture. And you can kind of see an example of a similar thing up here. So activities here to support phonics would be things like sounding out and blending words, matching to pictures and objects. So for example, if we look up here in the top right hand corner, you can see we've got a picture of the atom or the word that we want to spell. So we've got our picture of dog. So that's going to help us remember that that's the word that we want to sound out and spell. We've got a selection of letters here. Now this child's come on quite a long way, you can see, so she's got quite a lot of letters in front of her, but you might just have the letters D, O, G out, so those are just the ones that they have to choose, and they put them into the spaces on the grid to spell out and support and sound out and blend that word together. So again, as much support as the child needs to be able to do that activity, and gradually withdrawing the amount of support you give as the child becomes better at it, and making it slightly more challenging as the child becomes more able. You might also do activities like can you find or write the letters for the sounds in this word, and things like complete the word game. So we've got here 3 pictures, all of which end in at, and you might just ask the child to add in the first letter and talk about what happens if we change the cut in cat to a h. What word do we have now? But importantly, what you're doing here is you're applying those skills to reading and making the links with those printed letters really clear. Now we're going to supplement our phonics-based teaching, which is what we've just been talking about, with some whole or sight word learning. Now this is not the only way that children learn to read. It's going to be part of a comprehensive program of literacy instruction for the child that you're working with. Now we want to include some sight words. It's a strength for many children with Down syndrome, and indeed many high frequency words in English are not readily decodable. Okay, so you can't read them using a phonics based approach. For example, if you think of the word of as it is there, I mean, if that was phonically spelt, we might imagine it was spelt O-V, but actually, you know, if we were to read that phonetically, we would have off, which is a different word. So we need to be teaching high frequency words, some high frequency words as sight words, so that children learn to read those quickly and fluently. Oh, I'm very sorry. Okay, now as well as teaching high frequency words as whole or sight words, you might think about including other forms of words as sight words in your sight word reading instruction, and that might be tricky words in children's reading books. It might be character names or family names. Certainly when you're starting off, I would suggest that you use words or words that are meaningful, personally relevant to children, that they're going to find meaningful to learn to read. And simply print words on flashcards, so have the whole word on a flashcard and introduce it to children, drawing attention to the visual shape of the word and the letters, the sequence and form of the letters in that word, and provide lots of repetition, lots of feedback, lots of consolidation for learning of those letter sounds. Start with a small bank and repeat, consolidate learning those words until your child is comfortable with those words, and then introduce some new ones. Think about teaching a range of different word types so that you can start to build sentences. It's important that sight words can be read in context as well as in isolation. So think about using activities like the one you can see here, where we've learned a number of sight words and we start to put them into sentences. So building up individual words into sentences. You also need to be applying these skills in the context of book reading. So we need to make sure that children are given access to and lots of high quality opportunities to read books with and to you. So these are both published children's books, books that all children have access to in the classroom and at home. And you might also want to consider making some personalised resources which could be used as books in this context, and that will depend on the age and the stage of the child and the particular things that you're working on. But lots of opportunities to read books with you and to you, to practice these skills in the context of reading. Support the child to be able to read those books to you. So point out those decodable words that you've been working on. Ask them to sound out and blend them. Point out the sight words that they know in the books that you're reading, and ask the child to read those words. Repeated readings are really important here. Children can learn the phrases, learn the words, and start to join in with the readings. And you might want to think about creating books together for them to read to you. One of the things to point out here, of course, is that some of our older readers will still be quite far behind in terms of their reading development, and children's books may not be at the right age to motivate them. So in that case, we might want to create some of our personal books that are more targeted towards things that motivate them, and creating those personal resources together will be motivating to help encourage them to continue with their reading. Now that's kind of dealing with the word reading aspect. We also need to think about developing comprehension. And as I said at the start, comprehension is really important to develop from the outset. So we want to be emphasising reading for meaning throughout. We can do that by using activities like matching words to pictures. Now, comprehension depends upon decoding and broader oral language skills. So these are really important for reading comprehension. You need to be paying attention to the words and the grammar used in the materials that your student is reading. Check their understanding and support that with direct teaching where needed. Now, I know that Becky is going to talk more about language learning in the session tomorrow, so come back for some more ideas about how to support vocabulary and grammar development. Memory skills also play a role in reading comprehension, and we know that children with Down syndrome have got verbal memory difficulties in particular. So visual supports are really key here. Use pictures from the story, sentences from the story, and so on and so forth to support memory for what you've been reading. You can also think about supporting comprehension by targeting questions and also working on comprehension strategies. So question words are really important for thinking about comprehension. Who, what, where, when, why, all of those questions. And it's not necessary that children understand those question words. So it might be important to teach those question words, and that can be done using using visual supports. So for example, when questions are always about time, and we can support that, and who questions are about people, so we can support children to understand and be attuned to the kinds of information that those different comprehension questions are asking for. So think about teaching comprehension question words, and practice with the student asking and answering comprehension questions. And you can do that formally, but you can also do it informally through games like Guess Who and Go Fish, where you're kind of asking somebody else a question and listening out for the answer and understanding how questions work and how answers work. Support spoken language difficulties by giving children choices, for example, and picture selection tasks, maybe using written questions and answers so that we're not always relying on a verbal response to demonstrate comprehension. In terms of comprehension strategies, there are lots of different strategies that good comprehenders use, and I want you to think about teaching some of these strategies to help support your child's comprehension. So for example, looking back in a story to help us answer a question, that could be something that you could model and demonstrate for your child. If you've got a question to answer, can we look back in the story? Will that help us answer the question? Things like making predictions, so looking at pictures in a story, working out what might happen next. Sequencing activities, sequencing pictures, sequencing sentences that reorganise what happened in a story and help us to summarise and retell stories that we've read. And asking for clarification. Children with Down syndrome may not necessarily know how or when to ask for some clarification and support. So modelling how and when to do that when we're reading, maybe, you know, modelling putting up our hand, I don't really understand that. I think I need to ask for some help. That can help to support children to understand when and how they can ask for clarification to support comprehension. Now, writing activities can be built into the literacy activities we've talked about already, and I hope you've seen some ways in which writing and spelling work can be built into some of those early activities. You want to be practicing writing and spelling alongside those other literacy work, and use a variety of different tools to support writing. So pens, thick pencils, pencil supports, pencil grips, use different writing materials like paint, chalk, to encourage writing and mark making. Now there's a sequence of developmental progression where we might move from copying over the top and maybe working hand over hand with you to doing that independently, to then tracing over letters with either writing tools, writing implements, or with fingers, copying underneath text, so seeing you do it and then copying you in imitation underneath, onto copying your writing onto a separate page or a sentence strip. So think about starting simple, very early with copying over the top and gradually moving through the stages, and that might take time to do. Use structured supports, more free writing, so things like word web grids, like you can see here, to encourage children to support children to remember what they're writing about. And things like this resource here, this one's quite complex. You might want to just work on beginning, middle and end to start with, but having structured questions, structured resources that help support some of those writing activities. And writing is very difficult for our children, so think about alternative ways to record. Think about whether you could record maybe using an audio recorder or recording yourself on the iPad. Using the keyboard is really important to be able to email and write messages to each other. So there are alternative things to think about alongside developing those writing skills. This is an example of how literacy teaching might be structured. I'm going to run through this quite quickly. I'm aware I'm running out of time. We need to get on to the questions. But this is just an example of how a structured literacy session might look, where we've got short bursts of activity working on literacy in several different ways to help encourage and maintain engagement and motivation. Thinking about bringing literacy activities into your everyday lives, you could, for example, set up a snack shop where you've got items labelled, and you might have written sentence starters where you have your child have a carrier phrase like, please can I have some, and the child has to insert the snack that they want at the end there. You might have, for example, you might write a menu together for dinner. So these are ideas, that things you can bring into your everyday activities that are less about that structured, focused teaching, more about things that you could do that are fun, engaging, motivating, kind of everyday activities you can do at home. You might, for example, have a treasure hunt where you have written clues and you ask your child to read the clues and work out where they need to go next. You might want to send a letter or an email, maybe record what you want to say first and then write it out together, practice it, record it, write it out together. For those of you who are joining us who are running groups, maybe think about setting up a pen pal system between those who are in your groups to support this written kind of form of communication, sending letters, emails to each other. Maybe write simple instructions for a recipe or an activity and follow those together, and take pictures of some of these everyday activities that you've been doing. Write sentences to describe the pictures and share those with others. So these are just ideas for bringing literacy into some everyday activities you might do at home. Now here's some link to some further resources. The link there to the Down Syndrome Education International page for information on more information, training and resources. And that includes See and Learn and Reading and Language Intervention. There's also a link there to Special iApps, which are educational apps to support children with SEND, including children with Down syndrome. And they have some free resources to support you during COVID. So I would encourage you to have a look at their website. There are some further resources available to support phonics teaching, which are available online. Book Trust Home Time has some nice reading supports available for you, including books, videos, writing tools, as does Twinkle. So there are some resources for you. Now then, I'm going to move on to thinking about the pre-submitted questions. I'm not going to get a chance to run through all of these, I'm afraid. I'm aware I'm running behind time. One of those was about See and Learn. Should I move on to a new book when my child is able to select and match, or should I stay with the same book until the child can name as well? So the advice here would be, if your child has shown that they're able to select and match those words quite early on, then move on to the next book. So they've shown that they can understand those words and they're ready to move on to the next book. But as you're moving on to that next book to introduce some of those new words, do keep repeatedly revisiting that book you've been working on, so your child has an opportunity to practice naming those words as well. Okay, so you're going to keep revisiting that book as well as working on a new one. Now, See and Learn has a Facebook group, as does RLI actually. So if people have questions about See and Learn and about RLI, then they can post questions to those Facebook groups. And I know that Sue monitors those Facebook groups regularly. There was a question about moving on from 7 to 8-year-old style books to those suitable for older children. I mean, great that you're ready to move on to these books. I would say the thing to look out for here are books that are motivating, that the student wants to read. That's the main driver. Now, obviously, comprehension is going to be an extra challenge as you move on to some of those more difficult books. So you want to be making sure that you're looking at the language that's used and supporting the child to understand that language. You might also want to think about, as books get longer, we might need to do some more structured comprehension activities at various intervals during that book reading. So summarising sections, writing what's happened, discussing the book as you're going through it, those kinds of things will help to support comprehension of that particular book. What age do children with Down syndrome start reading? Well, as we talked about earlier, this will vary depending on the individual child. Some children are ready to start reading when they are about 3 and a half. Some children don't start reading until they start school, and other children don't start until they're much older. And the important message there is it's never too late. So if you're working with a child who is 10, 12, 15, young adults, it's not too late to get started with reading, and you follow the same structures, the same principles, the same activities, regardless of what age you're starting at. You will, of course, need to modify the resources that you use and some of the activities to make sure they're age appropriate, but the principles are the same no matter what age you start at. How can I support my child to move on from hand-over-hand pencil activities? Well, we mentioned earlier there's some kind of stage-wise approach to supporting some of these pencil activities, and it might take a while to move from one stage to another. What I would say is when you're practicing these activities, start with the hand-over-hand so that they are comfortable, familiar, and ready to try something a bit more challenging. And once you've done the hand-over-hand, I would maybe ask them to try copying underneath. As a way to move them on. Obviously build in some rewards here to make it motivating and encouraging for them to do it, and maybe use activities that you think are really going to hook them in. So it might be writing, for example, a word of a character or something that they're really interested in learning how to spell. It might be an activity where you're writing a message to somebody else, or a clue to a treasure hunt clue, but making sure that it is really motivating and engaging for the child is really important. And try using different materials, so using different crayons, using different it might be something to do with the tools or the implements that you're using that means that they're less reluctant, they're less happy to take on some of that themselves. So try switching around some of the tools and implements that you're using to do those activities. I'm currently going through the RLI module with a view to implementing in my school. School are quite resistant, so any tips to promote simple guidelines on how to implement? One thing I would say, if you are encouraging your school to use RLI, is to remind them that RLI is very much based on what we know works in terms of literacy support for children, and that is all children. Okay, so it is just good literacy teaching. So RLI will be useful for many other children in the classroom who are struggling with literacy, and I think that is one way to support the implementation of RLI in school, if school can see that there may be benefits wider than that individual child. Other kind of guidelines I would suggest are things like, if you're finding it difficult, maybe just try implementing the reading strand as a first step, and hold off on implementing the language strand until a bit later on once you've got a bit more comfortable. But again, RLI, there's a Facebook available to support RLI implementation, and please feel free to post questions to the Facebook page. Teaching non-verbal or slightly verbal children to read. Many of the activities that we've talked about today can be adapted to support a non-verbal response. So things that we've talked about include, matching activities, so matching letters or matching words, selecting words, for example, finding words among a series of choices that we don't require a verbal response for. We might want to think about things like ordering words into sentences. So rather than saying those words, we're ordering individual flashcards into sentences that match a picture. Using signs and gestures as well to support these reading activities for those children who are using signs. So many of these activities can just be slightly adapted to support a non-verbal way of responding. The last question I'll go through here of pre-submitted questions is: child is 9 years, using See and Learn in school. Progress is very slow and the child is showing resistance. I would say here we see this a lot, that See and Learn is used through a long time, and children get fed up of it, to be quite frank. So what I would say is employ a different approach with this child now. I talked earlier about that comprehensive approach to literacy instruction, and I would say that's what we need to be doing with this child, and not just using See and Learn, which is very much about using that whole word approach to support reading teaching. Lots of motivating resources, personalised resources to support her engaging in reading and literacy activities again, starting off with something that she likes, something that she can do. And using your reward strategies as well to encourage and support working on these things. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen at that point, and I'm going to take some of the questions that have come to us in chat for the rest of the session. Apologies if this is quite stilted, but I'm reading them as I answer. Okay. What should you encourage to learn letter names as well as phonetic sounds? Okay, so this is that business of, do we teach letter names or do we teach letter sounds? There isn't a clear line of research evidence about this, but what I would say is that children need their letter sounds to support reading development. And if it was my child, I would be teaching them their letter sounds first, and I would put off teaching them their letter names until they knew their letter sounds, because I would be worried about learning confusions. Okay, so that's just advice from with my own personal hat on. That's what I would be doing. I would be teaching letter sounds first, because I know that's going to support reading development, and once they have their letter sounds and they're using those in reading activities, then I would go on to teach letter names. We've got some chat comments about sound issues, which I'm sorry to hear about, and I do hope that people have been able to access the sound eventually. Okay. What prerequisite skills do you suggest the child has before introducing phonics? Okay. I would be arguing that children should be introduced to phonics when they start school, alongside every other child who is in the classroom learning to read with them. Now, we know that children who have got strong oral language skills in the foundational years, so in the preschool years, will find phonics learning easier. Okay, phonological skills, those oral language skills really do support that when children start school. We know our children are going to be delayed in those areas, but that doesn't mean that we should delay teaching them phonics. So I would say once they hit school, they start learning phonics as a way of learning to read alongside other children in the classroom. And we can start introducing some letter sounds and early phonological awareness games, as I said, in that preschool year. Can you give an example of how to support why or when questions for reading comprehension? Why is a very tricky one, isn't it? I would suggest for teaching when questions is a little bit easier, because when we're thinking about when, we're often thinking about time. So we can support that by thinking about and teaching children to think about before, next, after. We can think about supporting that with question and answering activities. I think the most important way in which we can support children to learn some of these tricky questions is simply by practice, and children will need lots of practice both in asking and answering these kinds of questions to support reading comprehension. And that can be done through general discussion as you're reading books. It can be done through activities like predictions. So we might look at a picture which shows, for example, a child with a bat and a ball and a window, and we might think, oh, what might happen next? And then we can link that back to why questions. So why did the window break? Because he hit the ball too hard or something like that. But essentially these are tricky things, so they are going to need quite a lot of support and a lot of practice and consolidation for asking and answering these kinds of questions. If we focus on teaching the letters by sound, okay, so I think I've already kind of answered that question. My daughter is able to read quite well, but comprehension is still a struggle for her. I would say that's very common. So lots of our children have real difficulties with comprehension, despite having good word reading skills. And that really is down to difficulties with oral language and grammar and difficulties with memory. She's at secondary school now. Any tips on how to engage her further? We tried highlighting questions with corresponding answers in the same colour. She can answer very basic comprehension tests but struggles on others. Again, I think much of this is about practice. I think writing comprehension questions is a really good idea here. I think often we ask questions and then expect children to be able to remember the answers. So having written questions and maybe highlighting some of those keywords in comprehension questions. So one thing we tried when we were thinking about comprehension strategies was having written questions, highlighting some of the keywords in those questions and physically looking back through books to find where we might find the context in that book to help us answer those questions. So using that look back strategy to help us answer the question. But again, you know, I think lots of practice is really important, and using materials which are motivating and meaningful. I think help to support drawing attention to some of these strategies. Okay, just got a reminder on time. How do I help my son who has severe speech and language disorder? He is 11, but only a very few words. Does see and learn work for a child who can't speak? Oh, okay, sorry. So this person has also said, I can see it's on your list to answer. Yes, we've talked about how these kinds of strategies, these kinds of things can be used with children who have got very limited verbal language skills. I'm curious as to why you suggested at the start that these are for parents. As a teacher, I've got so much from attending and I would really recommend it to my colleagues. Now, honestly, I haven't written that one myself. Thank you very much to the participant who said that. The reason I pointed out at the beginning is that it was for parents is that anybody watching the recording of this might expect there to be much more theory covered in anything that is to do with literacy instruction. And generally, I would include that. The reason I haven't done today is because this is very brief. You'll know I've been talking very fast for about an hour now and I still haven't got through half of the things I wanted to get through. So there's a lot to cover and that's why the focus is really on practical. But I think also when we set out with these sessions in mind, we set out with parents in mind and a way to support parents who are working at home. But I'm very pleased that as a teaching assistant you feel that you've benefited from the session, and please do recommend this to your colleagues. For parents as well, recommend this to the teachers that are working with your children or might be working with your children from September. The recordings will be available online. I'll say more about that in 1 second. For an older child, what spelling program do you recommend? You can spell lots of the sight words. Yeah, I did have a pre-submitted question about this as well. So there are some spelling programs available that you might want to check out. I don't have personal experience of them and can't validate them myself, but I know people have used these and found them helpful. So there is Clicker, which is a literacy tool, which I know people have used successfully. There's also Special Spelling, which is a special IAPS resource, and I directed you to special IAPS on the resources slide. And there's also Handwriting Without Tears, which I know that many people have used and used with success. So you might want to choose, look at some of those programs and see what might be useful for you. But the other thing I would say is check with school first, see if school are using a program already that might be implementable for you. Okay, in the classroom, should the child be doing this separately to the class or alongside as the class also learn phonics, for example? Great question. I would say in the classroom, your child should be doing this alongside the rest of the class, so they should always be included in all of these activities. But the other thing to mention there is that it might be beneficial to also do some extra supplemental one-to-one work with the child, particularly where some of these listening games come in where listening can be hard. So I would say, if possible, do both. And that might mean roping parents in to do some of these activities at home to support what you've been doing in the classroom. Okay. I think I'm going to just take one question and then we're going to have to finish up. Okay, this is a great one. I'll be teaching a child with Down syndrome for the first time in September. Are there any sources of information that you would recommend to help me understand Down syndrome and how best to support the child? I can absolutely direct you to the website of Down Syndrome Education International. There are many resources on here about Down syndrome and about the best ways of working with children with Down syndrome, and there are online training courses that you can take part in that it will enable you to support your student working with Down syndrome from September. But I do hope that you've at least got some helpful suggestions and ideas for things that you can try to get you started from this session. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to say before we finish this session. The first of those is thank you very much for taking part this evening. I do hope that it has been useful for you. I know it was very quick. It's a whistle-stop tour, lots of ideas and things to think about in there. The recordings will be made available from next week. So we are going to share the recordings of each of the sessions that are on this week. They'll be available on social media, free to view, and we'll share information about how you can access those recordings via the same channels by which we advertise these sessions. So if you found out about the sessions through your local support group or a Facebook page, you will find the information advertised through there again. But the other thing to say is, because you are registered, I have your email addresses and I will email all of the registrants directly with information about how to access the recordings so that you can access those from next week. I hope, as I said in my email to you earlier today, I hope you and I know you will appreciate that we aren't able, unfortunately, to answer your personal emails that ask for personal advice about your current situation, and that's simply because you know, we would literally be here forever answering those emails. But I do hope that this session this evening has given you some ideas for where to start and some places to go for some further information and advice and support. Lastly, I would be very grateful if you could fill in our evaluation survey. This is important for us to demonstrate the impact of what we're doing to the people that we work for. So if you could please go and fill in our short evaluation survey. It's only very brief. I think it's about 6 questions. You can either fill that in after each session that you attend, or you could choose to wait until the end of the week and go back and fill it in for the whole of the sessions that you've attended at the end of the week. I believe that a link to the evaluation survey has just been posted in the chat screen. Thank you to Steph. And it was also in the confirmation email that you received on registration. Lastly, I want to say a huge thank you to Steph Hargreaves, who has been amazing in helping me to set up these sessions and has provided my tech support this evening. She's been fantastic. And I want to flag, don't miss tomorrow's session. Becky Baxter is an absolute expert on Down syndrome, as well as on language learning generally, and has some brilliant ideas to share with you tomorrow about supporting language learning. So please do join us tomorrow night for that session. Thanks again. I'm off for a glass of wine, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you. Good night.